That right there is why I love edge fishing for carp. The anticipation, being sat there, you see a little boil down the bank or a little tail pop up and you just know your float is going to go under. Today I brought you up to Mainline Fisheries up here in Preston to run you through a bit of edge fishing for carp, and hopefully by the end of this video you can have a much better idea of how to fish it, how often to feed, what combinations of baits you can actually use in the edge, and hopefully you'll catch more fish when you're out on the bank next because of it. So if you want to know more, keep watching and I'll try and give you a few tips, a few of my little secrets into my edge fishing. So when it comes to where to actually fish in your peg and why you would fish there, for me, I always like to know what stamp of fish I'm fishing for. If I'm fishing for smaller fish, i.e. smaller carp in the 1 to 2 pound bracket, they will go into really shallow water. If I'm fishing for really big fish, then they can't fit in, say, 10, 12 inches of water. So having that little bit extra water over their head makes a big difference. It allows the fish to come in to, say, 16, 17 inch, which we've got today, with confidence, and they're not going to spook out the peg. If you go to venues where you can almost pick what depth to fish, say Larford Lakes for example, where it's almost like a beach, you can fish in 6 inch or you can fish in 20 inches. Because the fish are a big stamp, I always feel like a little bit more water over the heads is always a little bit better. If you go to venues where the fish are all 10 pound plus, again 2 foot is generally a nice depth. Here at Mainline, we've got fish ranging from sort of 2 pound up to 6 pound, with an odd bigger one, say 8, 10 pound. But I would say the average is around about 4 pounds. So for me, they're not massive. Them sort of 4 pound size fish, they can fit into a depth, anything between 12 to 18 inch is going to be perfect. We've already had a little plumb today and we've got about 17 inch, but I'm going to show you the reason why I'm fishing where I'm fishing. So I've 2 margins here. I've got a margin to my right where I can find a very similar depth, but I can't get right against the bank without the bank coming up. Whereas this left hand side margin, what we have here is when I go to plumb up right against the bank, I've got that depth, and as I'm coming off the bank, you can see there, it doesn't start to drop till about a foot off the bank, and then we go down and the slope's starting to drop off. So for me, what's important is that I can get my rig against the bank, and the reason for that is it acts as a little bit of a buffer, stops the fish blowing the bait beyond your bank, beyond your actual rig, sorry. It can't blow your bait any further away from the bank. Some venues it's slightly undercut, there's nothing you can actually do without that, but the tighter you can get against that bank, the better it will be. Now, in terms of plumbing up, you'll see here I've got about 1.5 inches to 2 inches on the bottom, and the reason for this is I'm going to lay my rig down the slope, draw my float to the bank, and I'm going to have sort of this little curve at the bottom. My rig is almost going to sit against the bank, my hook bait is going to be 1 inch or 2 off the bank, and the rig is not going to be affecting the fish. They're not going to come in, feel that rig and bolt away. If I can keep my hook bait right against the bank, or 1 inch off the bank, and keep that line all pinned against the bank, the fish are not going to touch the line and spook. So being able to get against that bank, keep the rig away from the fish is really important. And like I say, I'm plumbing it round about 1.5 inches to 2 inches over depth, because I'm going to lay that rig down the slope, draw it against the bank, and as I hold it against the bank, I can actually put my pole tip against the bank, stop that rig getting blown off the shelf. The shelf here is quite big, so that's nice. I've got a nice little dinner plate. It plumbs up absolutely perfect here, to be fair. If I was looking for a margin swim, this is exactly how I'd want it to plumb up. These have all basically been hand dug and they're all perfect. They're, really nice and flat, and you can actually put your rig against the bank there. Lovely, lovely. You can see me float just dropping down, and then when I get to here, it's going to start to drop off. That's no good. It's too slopey, so I want to be tight in against the bank, and that's where I'm going to choose to fish. But that's the reason why I've chose to fish there, because I've got a nice depth, which is really important. Too shallow, the fish won't come in. Too deep, the fish will sit off the bottom. I almost couldn't ask for a better margin. If you're looking for a margin, this is exactly what you're looking for. So when it comes to actually kick-starting your peg, carp are a greedy fish. You need to get a volume of bait in your peg so that they keep coming back to that spot. It's no good just putting a little kinder pot of pellets in and hoping the fish are going to keep coming back, because they'll come back, they'll eat it, there's nothing left to hold them there. So generally this style of fishing is best sort of later part of the match or in the afternoons when the fish are really starting to feed and come onto the bait. But you still need to gather the fish in the area. So I've got two pole pots here. I've got 200mm and I've got 300mm. If I was fishing for really big carp, 300mm would be my go-to pot. But today I'm fishing for sort of like 3 to 4 pound fish with an odd better fish. I feel like once the fish get in the peg, there's going to be enough bait there to hold them. I'll just be able to kinder pot over the top then. But to kickstart the actual peg, I'm going to start with my 200mm pot. So clip that onto my pole pot. With two options today, we've got ground bait and pellets. I'm going to start on pellets because if I can catch them on pellets, the bait itself doesn't cloud up the same as ground bait. It makes it a lot easier to catch the fish. Now, when I'm fishing with micros, I can fish multiple baits over it. I could fish an expander, but for carp, it doesn't really stand out. So for me, maggots and corn are my two favourite baits. Sometimes worm can be great as well, but maggots and corn are generally what I'm going to fish over the top of it. So I could put a few grains of corn in there as a little bit of a teaser, you know, just to give them a taste of the up bait. I don't want to put loads in though, so literally 30 bits of corn. And then what I'd do is I'd take 2 pots of micro pellets. First pot I'm going to put in there 200mm. Just put that onto there. And I go in. I'm on my marker, which is the end of this section here. So I can get to the end of this section. I like to always touch my pot on the water just to make sure I'm in the right position. So I can see there's like a little twig just against the bank. So I know, right, that's where I want to feed. And then what I like to do is I'll turn my pot, hold it in position, and the bait will just flush out of that pot because I've got holes in the bottom of it. Very similar to our fast release pots. Because there's no suction effect, your bait will just go straight down to the bottom. So that's my first pot. And I'll come back in again, do the same again, a few grains of corn, because I feel like corn's going to be a good up bait. Fished a festival here not long back, and corn was a great bait, to be fair. If I'm struggling for bites, I can put a few maggots in. Now I could do the exact same with this, with micros and maggots. You know, I don't just have to fish corn. So again, pot on the water, so I know I'm in the right position, turn it over, count to sort of 2 or 3, and your bait will all come out. That's how I'd sort of kickstart my peg. So the peg's fed there now. If I was fishing with ground bait is not as filling. So I would probably put, if I'm putting 2 pots of micros in, which is 400mm, if I was fishing with ground bait, I might double that volume. So I might end up putting 800mm of ground bait in, or 900mm if it was 3 big pots. With ground bait, I always like to feed that little bit extra. So if you go to a venue and you feel like pellets doesn't really work, ground bait's the way to go. You know, you'll hear people say about combinations, ground bait and maggots, ground bait and worm, etc. Ground bait on its own is a great attractor, but it can make the fish harder to catch. If I can't catch on micro pellets now, what I'll do is I'll go in there and I'll put a pot of ground bait in. Because I've already got some bait in my peg, i.e. the micro pellets, I can always switch to ground bait later and put that in. But if I was starting my session and I just knew that ground bait was the best bait at that venue, that's what I would do. I'd go in, I'd put 3 pots of ground bait or 4 pots of ground bait in, a little bit more. And what I always like to do when I'm feeding my ground bait is have it that little bit drier. So I'm using bagger mix today. I've gone for a 2-part ground bait, 1-part water ratio, and that leaves it perfect. It's sort of like a medium consistency. It's quite dry, it'll cloud really well. When I start fishing it, then I'll clag it up, and what I'll do by that is I'll add some pellets to it, might use a 50-50 mix, and I'll clag it up and make it a little bit heavier by adding a little bit of water to the pellets, which I'll talk to you a bit more in detail in a bit when it comes to just sort of kinder potting my bait over the top. But in terms of ground bait, if I want them to come in, I want them to actually cloud it up, you know, feel like the fish are going to come back to it. When I hook a fish, the fish will come back to that bait, and then that way is a great attractor to the fish. When I actually start catching, or there's a lot of fish in my peg, I don't want my ground bait to be actually that dry. So I'll talk about that in a bit and see how you can actually tweak it. So what I want to show you today is actually a few different combinations that you can use for edge fishing for carp in shallow water. Like I said, I always like to start on pellets. I feel like that's an easy way of catching them. And obviously you might go to a venue, for example, where ground bait's not allowed, so then you haven't really got the option of ground bait. You have to fish with micros. There's certain venues around the country where that is the case, and that's where micros and corn, micros and maggots is a great combination. Today I'm actually going to start on micros and corn. So single piece of corn, I go in through the top and out through the side. Sometimes you can use double corn for this. If you're catching really big fish, double corn can be a great hook bait. But today we're only sort of catching 3 to 4 pound fish. If we start catching some real big fish, then we can always try double corn. Pole pot wise and volume of bait, you might think, right, well, you've kick-started your peg there with 2 big pots of pellets. It's took about half an hour and I did see a little vortex, so I know that something's been and had a look. They're not going nuts, they're not tailing up, but there's going to be something lingering in that area, hopefully. So I just want to start with a small pole pot. Now on certain days, this might not be enough bait and I might have to up my pole pot size, or I might even have to go and put a big pot in after every fish until the fish arrive in numbers. Once the fish are there, I can feed smaller amounts of baits and just keep the fish coming back. But to start with, I need to get them fish coming to my peg and visiting regular. So I'm going to start with some micro pellets. I've got the large fast release on here. If I can't get a bite on this, I'll go up to the XL. So the XL, it's a pot that's not actually out yet, but it's something we're going to bring into the range. It holds the same amount of volume as the paste pot, so really good for carp fishing. If I've got loads and loads of fish coming in my peg, I wouldn't hesitate to drop down to a medium. But to be honest, if these fish are going to be hungry and greedy, a large is probably going to be the smallest amount of bait I want to be feeding at least every chuck. That medium is probably more suited to when you've got a lot of fish visiting your peg, i.e. F1s and some carp as well. So if we start getting a few F1s mixed in, then the medium could be good, but hopefully we're going to catch predominantly carp down here. We're going to get an odd F1 because there is some F1s in here, but hopefully if I was fishing for carp, then this would be sort of the right amount of volume. So get to my marker, don't worry about my rig, turn my pot and just put it on the water and let the actual pot do the work for you. And then I'll pick my rig up and I'll pull that rig against the banking, and now everything is sat against that bank. I've got back shot 2 inches away from my float, so that's helping draw that float against the bank as well. You can imagine everything is lay against the bank, or as tight to the bank as I can get it. If anything comes in now, hopefully it won't hit the line and spook itself, because everything's sat against the banking. So the fish are going to come up that slope into the shallow water, and then hopefully we get us bite. So it's a case now, sitting, waiting, being patient. Sometimes you won't see the fish. You know, you think, oh, there's nothing there. Other days you'll see swirls, tails, bit of mud coming up. Some days you just don't see anything and you'll sit there and it'll just be like clean as a whistle, straight under. You wouldn't even know it's there, and it could be an 8-10 pound fish. Even in that shallow water, they can just creep up that slope very slowly sometimes. So I'm keeping that rig dead still. There's a bit of movement there, but it could be from smaller fish. If I've not had a bite here within like 2 or 3 minutes, probably more like 3 minutes, I might be a little bit more patient, but let's say 3 minutes, then I'm probably going to come back in and refeed again. If I get an opportunity, the float goes under, the fish brushes all my bait and my rig everywhere, again I'll come back and I'll set my trap again. I don't want to sit there. Once the fish has been in and wafted the bait everywhere, I don't want to sit there hoping to get a bite. I'll come back in, I'll feed that little spot again, I'll try and drag them fish up that slope. But first thing I want to try here is just fishing with micros and corn. Then I'll show you micros and maggots. Here now, so I've got a liner there. Here now, I can literally put any bait I want over the top of this. I can fish micros with a piece of meat, a piece of corn, maggots, worm. They're all great hook bait choices. I'm not just, you know, I feel like corn's good because it's heavy, it's visual. You know, it's not going to get wafted about like a little expander or a double maggot would. Maggots is great because it's such a light hook bait. Worm's great because you can, you know, it's a real big but soft hook bait. Again, meat, nice and soft, but for carp, I always like to try micros and corn first. That is like my go-to. Meat's banned at a lot of venues, so that's sometimes not an option. Maggots, sometimes you catch a lot of silvers and nuisance fish, so again, that might not be an option on some venues. Whereas corn, it's a little bit silverfish resistant. You know, you don't get mired off as many silvers. And it's also, like I said, it's heavy, it's visual. It's perfect carp hook bait. So I've had a couple of feeds there now. A few little indications, but I don't feel like I'm putting enough bait in. So what I'm actually going to do is swap my pole pot. Before I go back to a big pot, I'm going to swap my pole pot and put the XL on. So I'm feeding a larger volume of micros. Now, it might be the case here where they want ground bait to draw the fish into the shallower water. So if this doesn't work now, or it gets me an odd fish, I'm already thinking in my head, maybe I need to put a bit of ground bait in to make it more attractive to the fish. But let's just try this slightly larger pot first. Maybe the fish want a lot of volume of bait to bring them in. I don't feel like a big pot every chuck is going to be the answer for the stamp of fish, because, you know, the average weights on this sort of venue are in excess of £100. You're probably going to be catching like 20-30 fish. You're not going to probably big pot after every fish. You'd need about 3 or 4 kilo of ground bait to do that. So at some point they're clearly going to be kinder potting and catching, just kinder potting over the top of, you know, a volume that you've laid down. Generally that's what you find, is the more fish you feed, the more fish you catch numbers wise, the smaller amount of bait works. Little and often generally is better. When you're fishing for maybe 6 or 8 edge fish and they're all £10 a piece, that's when a big pot every chuck can sometimes work. So let's just try this slightly larger pot, a little bit more volume of bait, and just see if this one actually works. So I'm probably a minute and a half into the cast now, and I've just seen a few little silvers scatter, so hopefully something's lingering about. Hopefully that XL pot, just a little bit more bait, started to bring a fish in and up that slope. Like when the fish are not naturally sat in the shallow water, and it's a little bit cooler and stuff like that, really warm days, that's generally when your margin fishing's best, because it warms up the most. If you've had a bit of rain, sometimes it takes a while for them fish to come in. And also, the later in the day, the later in the session, the more you've been feeding it, more fish start to visit your peg naturally as well. But just fed that little bit more volume of bait, and I've just, like I say, seen a few silvers scatter, so hopefully we can get a bite off this. A little bit of a liner there. One sign before, when I just fed that large, just that little bit extra bait, but I feel like if the fish are not coming in really quickly, sometimes ground bait can just transform that peg, that extra bit of cloud, extra bit of attraction. Like I say, that's what I'm already feeling now. Is I've already kick-started my peg by putting 2 big pots in. Normally I'd like to build it up for around about an hour before I went on it. Today we've given it like 20 minutes, we've seen a sign of some fish, we've gone down there. Probably a little bit too early, to be honest, but you know, we're filming today, so we want to make sure that, you know, we get through everything. It's not about catching loads of fish today. What it's about is showing the different combinations with your margin fishing. Once we get it right, you'll start catching regular. So I've just seen a little bit of a swirl there, slightly off the bank, so I know there's definitely a fish in my peg now. Coming up to probably 2.5, nearly 3 minutes as well. So if I didn't get one in sort of like, I know there's one there now, so I'm going to wait, but if I didn't get one after that sort of 3-minute period, I would be shipping back and refeeding again. You know, you don't want to sit there waiting too long. When you're kinder potting, you're basically feeding an amount of bait, hoping the fish come in. If they don't come into it, you need to feed again to try and attract another one into your peg. A lot of people will sit there and they wait too long, 6, 7, 8 minutes. Before you know, time's pass you by, your chance has been and gone anyway. So I'm just going to give it another 20 seconds here. If I don't get a bite, I'll come back in, I'll feed again. We had a couple of indications that chuck. This time, I'm just going to feed again. Like I said, I've been in there about 3 minutes. I've seen a few small fish scatter, so I know there's been a fish present. So it was much better feeding the XL rather than the large. Something happened. Even though we didn't get a clean bite, we had signs that there was fish in the peg. So hopefully this time now, this will be like our fourth chuck. Fourth chuck without an actual proper bite. But as soon as I fed that XL, I had signs, and sometimes that's what you've got to do, is just up your volume of feed and you'll get a sign. And there's too many fish coming in, we'd lower his volume of feed because there's too much feed in the peg and the fish would be going mad and nuts. But you have to draw the fish in first. Don't worry about, you can't really overfeed your peg. A lot of people think, oh, I might overfeed my peg, I'm not getting bites, maybe I've put too much bait in. No, the reason you're not getting bites is because the fish are not there yet. Once they're there, and it's not a case of piling loads and loads of bait in, because then you could spoil your peg, but once the fish are there, then you start to be able to work out how much you should feed, how often you should feed, you know, what you should be feeding. Like I say, I'm already getting the feeling that ground bait is going to be needed to draw the fish in today. But I always like to start on micros, because if micros would have worked and it would have been good, and it might still be good, but I'm going to swap it to ground bait anyway just to demonstrate for you. But if micros was good and the fish was straight on the bait and really aggressive and feeding like mad, then all of a sudden it's easier to catch them rather than having a big cloud of bait getting kicked up and wafted about and potentially foul looking fish then. But if the fish are behaving, you know, and they're just coming in ones and twos and not going mental for it, then sometimes ground bait is the best option. Again, a few silverfish just scattered there, which tells me there's a fish now in the peg. Them silvers are only going to scatter when something bigger comes and has a look in the peg, and again, another little silverfish just sort of topped and moved away. Almost like little roach fry, to be honest. They're not like anything worth catching. They're not getting mithered. My float's not really bobbing about or anything. It's just some fish obviously lingering around the bait. But it lets you know when there's a fish there. There we go. That's his first bite. It's his second feed on that XL pot. The first two feeds, I had one sign. It just felt like more stuff was happening when I fed that XL, so took us 4 feeds, probably took around about 10 or 12 minutes to catch that fish. We've not really give it loads of time for the peg to sort of, for the fish to come in and find the bait. Like I say, we only give it about 20 minutes. I've got black hydro in here, just to match the sort of stamp of fish we're going to be catching. I'll run you through the actual rig in another section in a second, but rig wise, you want something that's durable. When you're catching in the margins, you don't want something that, you know, potentially can get broke on. It's not about bullying the fish, but it's about making sure you've got a chance of landing anything that you're going to hook. Decent stamp fish. Wants to run a little bit now, so just keep that pole low. Try and get him under control. I remember when I come here the other week, the fish were fighting fit, fought really well, to be fair. And this one's putting up another little scrap here. So if he wants to run, just drop that pole tip, bring him back near your feet. Good, not half pulling. Come on, Mr. Carp. Just take your time, no rush. Gonna pop up in it any second. There he comes. Was a bit bigger than I thought, actually. I thought it was only about £4. He's probably more like 6. Real fat fish. Probably £6.5 to be fair. So now probably near 7 actually. It's quite a heavy fish that. So lovely start. Now I could go back in there, keep potting micros, and probably have a decent run of fish. Once they find the bait, the fish will probably come to it. But I feel like if I feed some ground bait, it might bring the fish in a little bit quicker. So when it comes to ground bait, I'm not going to kickstart my peg again, but ground bait, because it's such a fine particle, what would have happened then? When I hook that fish, the commotion in that shallow water, your bait gets kicked about and ground bait will kick back up. It's almost like you're putting another pot of bait in. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to stick with corn on the hook. I'm going to feed my ground bait as it is currently in the actual bait tub here, which I would say is a medium consistency. So it's a little bit on the drier side, and like I said, this is basically mixed 2 parts ground bait to 1 part water. And what this will do is it'll cloud up very easily. Now some days you can feed it like this all day. A lot of people just automatically think ground bait, carp, you want it really heavy, but when it's heavy, it's inert, and the fish sometimes there's not as much attraction there. It don't kick up as much, it don't cloud as much. Sometimes you want a ground bait to actually cloud up. If I feel like there's too many fish coming in, my rig getting moved about, I'm foul looking an odd fish, then I need to calm the fish down, and that's when I can make my ground bait heavier, and I can put some micros in with my ground bait as well as, and what that does then, it gives the fish some food content, but you still get the cloud, and you get a bit of best of both worlds if you like. You're feeding them with some micros, you've also got the cloudiness of the ground bait, but I can dampen it off so it doesn't cloud too much. But I want to just get the fish in my peg to start with, so I'm going to go 200 of ground bait and I'm going to go straight back on top of it. Now obviously if I was in a match situation today, I've just caught one on micros, what I'd probably do is just go back in with micros to start with, but I just want to demonstrate like more of the actual combos we've got. So bait in position. This is, if you're fishing for like really big carp, sometimes this is the way you might have to catch them, is literally catch a fish. Don't need this pole pot for now, so I'll take that pole pot off. I can go a combination of baits, like I said here. I could put a bunch of maggots on, put a piece of corn on. I'm going to stick with corn because I know corn is nice and visual, it's heavy. I know it works well on this particular venue. It's a great, like I say, great carp hook bait. And I just literally go straight back over the top of this now. I've fed a nice volume of bait. Hopefully the fish will come back over the top of this. We'll be able to catch one on this. And then, because I've put some ground bait in now, plus whatever micros are in the area, I've got plenty of bait in my peg. The ground bait will just attract the fish back to your peg quicker than micros some days. Once I catch a fish here now, I might find, oh, that was a little bit quick. I'm then going and just kinder pot ground bait over the top of it. So that's like how I'd sort of switch from micro pellets to ground bait. Some venues, I would literally just fish ground bait from the off because I know micros doesn't draw them in. I'll still put some micros into my ground bait because that will give the fish some actual food content. And on certain venues, you can cut the micros out and you can add corn to it, you can add maggots to it, you can add meat to it, you can add whatever you want to your ground bait. Your ground bait is your attractor, and then your particles are what you want the fish feeding on. Some days I will just feed ground bait though and no particles, and then I can just fish all different kinds of hook baits over the top of it. Try and work out what the best hook bait is. Today we've got the option of fishing corn, maggots, we can fish worms over the top. You know, I've got a bag of worms down here where I can put a full worm or half a worm over the top of it and have a real big hook bait. But if you're fishing for sort of 3 to 5 pound carp with an odd bigger one like 7-8 pound maybe, sometimes the best hook bait is the smaller ones, like a single piece of corn or 4 or 5 maggots on the hook, just small particles that the fish can pick out. So I'll go back in now, put a big pot of ground bait in, we'll see if this draws a fish in. If it does, we might catch this fish and then we might start kinder potting over the top again. So I've got a situation here now where I've put that big pot in, the fish have come straight to it, but I've not caught one for like 4.5 minutes. A lot of people now be tempted to just sit here and hope that they get a bite because they put a lot of bait in, 200 ground bait. You're sort of hoping you'll get a bite rather than making that bite happen. So the situation I'm faced with here is, do I come back in and put another big pot in, or do I come back in and just kinder pot over the top? Me personally, because I feel like I've fed enough bait and the fish are starting to linger, again you can see the fish scatter, I feel like they've been in 2 fish potentially have been in and probably moved that ground bait about a little bit. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to just putting that Kinder pot back on. Again, I'm going to go with the XL pot because I feel like I'm feeding ground bait. That's going to be the way to go. Fill that up to the brim, and I'm basically just keeping that dinner table, that little plate where I've sort of fed, if you like, just topped up with food. You know, keeping that peg, just enough bait in that peg to keep them fish interested in coming back. So, little Kinder pot on the end of it, draw that rig back in. Any bait that they may have wafted about, hopefully I've just topped that peg back up now. So the cloud going through the water is obviously going to attract the fish, and there's going to be enough bait there so when the fish find it, hopefully they'll stay in the peg a little bit longer. If I'd have just sat there for 7, 8, 9 minutes, probably 10% chance of catching a fish. If I come back in and reset my trap now though, I've got a much higher percentage of actually catching a fish this chuck. So hopefully my chances of catching on this chuck now, because I've gone and reset my trap, has gone up to like 60-80%. There we go, straight away within like 30 seconds the fish was lingering, but I didn't feel like I was going to catch it. I've put that bit of ground bait in, it's gone straight under again. So great example of why you should come back and refeed again. Don't think it's a massive fish, but it was a nice clean bite and the fish instantly come back to that little cloud. It's more like the average stamp. This is what I was sort of catching on the festival the other week. I feel like this is probably average for what's in the lake, sort of like 3-4 pound fish. There we go. Absolutely immaculate condition. Lips and everything are perfect on them. Slip him back. Now again, I've got combinations that I could try. Do I want to fish with ground bait maggot? Do I want to fish with ground bait corn? Do I want a big pot? Do I want to go back in with a Kinder pot? Me personally now, I would go back in with a Kinder pot. I'm going to stick with corn for the time being. Just see if we get another one on this. But I feel like a big pot is not the answer. Now what can happen is you can Kinder pot sometimes for 2 or 3 chucks and nothing happens. Then I feel like I need to go and put another big pot in. But for now, Kinder pot on, go back in and just see if there's any fish still lingering. If in 2 or 3 chucks time, which would be around about 8 to 9 minutes, if I'm feeding every sort of 2.5, 3 minutes or so, 8 to 9 minutes time, if I hadn't had a bite, which would be sort of like 3 Kinder pots worth, then I feel like, right, well that hasn't worked, I need to then go and put a big pot in and try and drag some fish back in. There we go, another one fell to the Kinder pot. This time though, I feel like it took a little bit longer, and you'll notice it's actually a smaller fish. Now, we had 3 or 4 fish off that line coming into the Kinder pot, and it's been good for 3 or 4 fish. And then finally, I've gone in and I've caught myself a little small F1, which is not ideal when we know there's big carp present. So this is telling me 2 things really. I've had my little run on my Kinder pot, you know, probably had 4 carp, 5 carp and that F1. That time it took a little bit longer. It's telling me now that my bait is probably running out in my peg. And this is a common situation that you're going to be faced with. And this is now the time to pick up the big pot again. So me personally now, I feel like I need to sort of kickstart that peg again. Make sure there's enough bait there. I've had a good little run, just Kinder potting, nice and simple. Kinder pot, go in, wait, fish are coming to your bait, catch a fish, fish are coming in regular, great. When you get to this point now where they're not coming in as obvious, the fish are going smaller, it's the perfect time to actually tell you to put some bait in. Now, this is exactly what I would do if I was, well, not even in a match situation. If you're pleasure fishing, this is just telling you that your peg has not got enough bait. So we need to hold them fish, but we also need to attract them in as well. So go back in with sort of like another 200 ml, bait in position. And then what I'd do is I'd take my pot off my pole and probably go straight back over the top of that. See if I caught, or I could go in with an empty pole pot, it doesn't matter. But take my pot off, go back in with that, see if I caught a fish off it, great. If I did and it was a good sized fish, even better, because you bring them straight back into your peg. And then I'd slip the Kinder pot back in, go back in and see if there's enough bait there to hold the fish. Now, in certain situations, like I said, if you're catching big carp, sometimes they won't come in until the last hour of the match, and it might take a full pot to catch one fish. On other days, there'll be loads of fish coming in, and a Kinder pot, you might be able to Kinder pot for say an hour. If you don't feed enough though, and you only say feed a large or a medium sized pot, your bait will run out very quickly. So by having that sort of XL pot, you know it's enough bait, especially when you're carp fishing, to keep them interested for longer. So it's all about how much bait to feed. I can see there straight away a little boil on my peg. They've come straight back to that volume of bait. The 200 ml has drawn probably some carp back into the peg, which is great. So I could probably go back in there, catch another fish. Now, the only other thing that might help you catch more fish is working out what to actually put in your bait. At the minute, I'm just feeding ground bait, and ground bait is the best attractor you can get. It's the smallest particle, but there's times when you need particles into it. So what I'm going to do is run you through a few different combinations now, just that allows you to add a few more particles in, because just feeding ground bait might not work on a certain venue. You might need to add some micros to it, some pellets, some maggots. Different combinations of bait can work, so I'm going to run you through what combinations could potentially work. First thing I do when I get to my peg is prepare my bait. So bait wise, dead simple today. I've got SK2 pellets, which I'm going to use my micro pellets for my feed. I've got some of the bagger mix, which again I'm going to use as my ground bait, and then we might use them in conjunction with each other, might use them separate, but I'm just going to run you through how to actually prepare what I've got. So starting off with the actual pellets, because it doesn't get any easier. I've got about a pint of water in there, so all I'm going to do is just add some pellets to that water. If you go 1-to-1 ratio, pellets and water, you're not going to be that far off. So just keep tipping them in there a sec. Pull them out of the way. So you'll see there now, I've got just the same amount of pellets as water. The pellets are just starting to pop through. Could probably get a tidgy few more pellets in there. So what I'm going to do is drain a bit of water off. That's what I want, where the pellets are just popping through the actual surface of the water. Leave them be, and what you'll end up with them is perfect Blue Peter style, these sort of pellets that are softened up all the way through. So you could squeeze them into a ball, which we're not going to really be doing today, but that's what we're going to end up with. So pellet wise, don't get any easier. 1-to-1 ratio, water and micros, that's your pellets done and prepared. Ground bait is a little bit different. So starting off, I've got a kilo bagger mix here, which is roughly around about 3 pints of ground bait, dry ground bait straight into the bucket, and then to that I want to add half water. So 3 pints of water, 3 pints of ground bait, 1.5 pints of water. What this will give you then is what I would call a medium consistency ground bait. You can't mess your ground bait up if you do it like this. So straight into the bucket, start getting that moving about. So let's just get some air into that, get it going. What'll happen here now is it'll take it on. I just give it a little bit of time to take the water on as well. And then your ground bait is going to be a medium consistency. You can actually play about with that as the day goes on, which I'll talk to you about a bit more in detail later on. Leave that now. Distributed the water around mainly to a lot of the areas. Leave that, let it set. I'll pass that through a riddle, and then I said we'll end up with like a medium consistency ground bait, and then I can fine tune it as I'm fishing later on. Hook bait wise, if we're fishing with micro pellets, I always like, if I'm fishing for carp, to fish a bit of corn. Corn is a great hook bait when it comes to carp fishing. It's heavy, it's visual, really good for carp. Maggots will catch you a bit of everything. Can also be brilliant for carp, dead maggots. So all I do with these, I just store them in just enough water to cover the maggots. Don't keep them underneath the water, just enough to keep them from drying out basically, because if they dry out they'll start to float. So keeps a nice colour to them. I've got a mixture of red and whites here. Probably going to find that 4 or 5 maggots on the hook's really good. Sometimes putting as many as 10 on the hook can be good, but in here the fish are probably averaging 4 to 6 pounds. A few F1s as well as, even the big carp though, 4 or 5 maggots is just enough. It's a substantial enough size bait that the fish can actually eat it. And then I've got some good old trusted Bilsdale worms for the hook. Nice big juicy worms. Sometimes you get worms that are a little bit too small, and sometimes they're not big enough. You end up having to put 2 of them on. With these I can just put one massive big dendrobina on, and I can even put half on sometimes. Nice big fat juicy worms. That's a real good hook bait for carp, but that's just an option if I need to fish with a real big bait. So I've got pretty much everything covered there. Maggots, corn, worm, I can fish all them baits over the top of micro pellets. I can fish all them baits over the top of ground bait as well as. Sometimes if you're just fishing for smaller fish, soft pellets can be good, so fishing an expander over the top of it could be really good. But for me, when I'm feeding for carp and I'm fishing, you know, in the summer months, shallow water, you're feeding quite a lot of bait, you tend to find that you need your hook bait to stand out a little bit more. So that ground bait now has just been left to set for a couple of minutes. I'd normally leave it a little bit longer than this, but just so you can see what I'm on about, when you pass it through the riddle, most of it should go through, and then you'll be left with the lumpy bits. That's just where the water's not distributed enough, and this is why you pass your ground bait through a riddle. So you push it through, give it a shake to the middle, push it through. Don't like using whisks either. When I'm fishing, margin fishing and stuff like that, any sort of commotion, the fish hate it. So if you can do it by hand, do it, you know, well back from the bank if you can. Try not to scare any fish. And what you'll end up with then is this dry, medium-ish consistency. You can still make it into a ball. That would be absolutely perfect if I was, say, fishing for skimmers and stuff. But what it's great for as well, everyone always thinks that you need to get your ground bait as damp as possible, which in some cases is always the best way. But if you want to attract fish into your peg, you need to basically get them there, and it's the cloud that does it. Once they're in your peg, then we can tweak this mix a little bit later on with the use of micro pellets. I'll go a bit more into detail that later on, but in terms of preparing it, that's how I like to prepare it, to that sort of consistency, which again, like I say, medium consistency. It's going to sink because it's had time to take some water on. All the pellets in there, they've all took some water on now. They've all got a little bit of weight to them. We can get more water into this mix, but if it's a hard day and you need to attract the fish into your peg, having it a little bit on the drier side, or if I was fishing a method, for example, totally separate conversation altogether, but that's how I'd have it for the method. If I was fishing it and I wanted to attract fish, this is how I'd start. If I've got lots of fish in my peg, this would be a little bit too dry, so then I need to tinker it a bit. So that's my ground bait prepared. My micro pellets are taking them water on as we speak. That's going to be the final product. And then we've got some hook baits as well. So quite simple to prepare it, but get this bit wrong to start with, and you know, it can make or break your session sometimes. So have a little think of how you want to prepare it. Ground bait wise, 2 parts ground bait, 1 part water. Micro pellet wise, 1-to-1 ratio, micros and water, you can't go wrong. So different types of bait combinations. As you can see here, I've laid some out for you just to give you an understanding of what there actually is. So micros and corn, you know, you can fish anything over that. Neat micro pellets like that. You can fish a piece of corn, piece of meat, piece of worm, dead maggots, bunch of maggots. If that's not working, sometimes feeding that ground bait like we have done today, just feeding ground bait, neat ground bait, piece of corn over it again, You can fish maggots over it like we've got showing here. You can fish worm over that, piece of meat over that. I generally find that expanders don't work when you're feeding big volumes because it blends in too nicely. You need something that stands out, and as you can see, corn is definitely by far the most visual. Now there is venues where ground bait's banned and you ain't got the option of switching to ground bait, and that's when other baits can come into play. So rather than just feeding bland micro pellets, you could sometimes put a little bit of corn in with it, but one thing that's worked for me in the past is having a mixture of micros and maggots. So micros and maggots, places like Belinge, caught some massive weights fishing like that. You know, they love them maggots, but they also like the smell of them pellets as well. All I'd basically be doing with that is as I'm fishing, I always like to have a little mixing tub. So you can imagine, as I'm going along, I'd put some pellets in a tub, I'd take a bit of maggot, probably do a mix of like, I don't know, maybe one part maggot to 5 part micros, and I can just pick that up then. Instead of, when you're catching a lot of fish, instead of having to take a pinch of maggots and then capping it with micro pellets, taking a pinch of maggots, capping it with micro pellets, you can have it all in one tub and you can just be filling your pot up like that as you go. So that's a great way of doing that. And then the last sort of final mix that I always sort of go to, if you like, is my 50-50 mix of micros and ground bait. But you'll see the colour looks slightly different, and this is because this mix here, it's really damp and inert, and I've clagged it up a little bit, so it's always a little bit claggier. And all I do with that, I'll just get rid of them for a sec, give them there, is I'd be having a tub with some ground bait in. And I always like to have a mixing tub here. If you can use a bigger tub like that, perfect, because it gives you the room. But let's say if I was to measure this out, I'd say, right, two parts ground bait. So 2 parts ground bait. And this will give me a 50-50 mix. I'd take my micro pellets. And my micros, you might want to go 2 parts ground bait, 1 part micro, but I would dunk that micro pellet then in the water, in the edge for example, and what happens is your micros then all become wet. Once the water's drained off, this stops you getting up and riddling your ground bait again halfway through your session. I can add them micros to my ground bait, and as I mix them now, it'll make the ground bait damper, but at the same time the micros stop it from clagging. So it's a great way of getting your ground bait a little bit heavier without actually getting back up and having to riddle it. Because if you've already got particles in your mix like this, you imagine now I try to pass that back through a riddle, I've got micro pellets in it, so it's a bit of a nightmare. But by wetting your micros, you can actually make it a little bit damper. So if this mix dried out throughout the day, all I'd have to do is take some more micro pellets, make sure they're wet. So obviously I'm trying to imitate them micros being dunked under the water. They drain off the excess water. You don't want too many, you just want your wet pellets. They can go into my mix, and then again I can start to distribute them micros about, and I can get what I call like a claggy sort of mixture. So it's a lot damper, it'll sink a lot heavier. This is great when there's a lot of feeding fish in your peg. The drier mix, as you'll see here, slightly different in colour. This stuff is how I like to have it to start with. It's nice and dusty and it's sort of like clouds and brings the fish into your peg. But when the fish are feeding, this stuff's a lot more inert. It'll go down quicker. It doesn't cloud as much, but it still clouds. So you're getting the attraction of the ground bait. Plus we've got some particles in there as well. And then if you wanted to, say you was big potting it and you felt like corn was working really well, you could just put a few grains of corn in the bottom of your pot, cap it with your mixture, and if you was having to big pot that sort of every fish, you know, you'd get that sort of bit of ground bait, bit of corn, you imagine that's mixed up on the bottom. That'd be great. Sometimes that can work really well when you're fishing for big carp. So a few different combinations there for you. Obviously we've got some worms there for the hook. Worm you can fish over micros, ground bait, no problem. Maggots, again, you can fish over micros and you can fish with ground bait, but don't be scared to combine some of these baits. Ground bait is a great attractor. Micro pellets are the best sort of feed pellet you can get. They just love eating them. They love eating the ground bait, but with the ground bait, because it's so fine, they can't always actually eat it, so it sends them a bit mad. Sometimes you have to calm them down and actually give them something they want. So give them some actual food content. So by adding some particles in there, mixing a few together, think about the way you actually add your micros to your ground bait. By making your micros wet, you can also change the mixture just by adding the micros to it, and that's how you get the most out of fishing with micros and ground bait. So good little tips there for you. Just think about what you're doing, and hook bait wise, just remember corn, maggots, worms, they pretty much go with anything.